Hi, my name is Ricardo Da Costa. I am a DJ, promoter, restaurateur, husband, father, and a pretty average golf player. So pre-COVID, I was involved in quite a few things. I own 2 restaurant social spaces, venues. One called the Ivy Champagne Garden, which is like a rooftop venue in Bedford View, and Altitude Beach, which is a day club, restaurant, social space that we opened in November 2019, and still very much DJing, playing as a resident on Carl Kassim's show on 5FM, and still very much involved with Soul Candi. Our focus is very centered around music education, and we still do obviously events, most notably Spring Fiesta and H2O, Electric Circus, but obviously with the pandemic, all that's been throttled. So when the COVID hard lockdown happened in March last year, as a business owner, there was obviously a sense of urgency and I wouldn't really say panic, but a strong level of concern for, how does one actually process having every single streamline of business throttled with no money coming in. Besides that, obviously the families and the people that I'm responsible for that are employed by me and the establishments that I own, that was quite a heavy bearing scenario to process. So I think my strategy with a lot of courageous moments is really don't act, when you're too emotionally charged in either way, whether it's something that's really positive and energetic that's happening or something that's really devastating like the pandemic. Just take time to process and assess what's going on. Ultimately, everyone was in the same position. So it's not like, I was the only one that was being affected by this. So I took comfort in that there was going to be a lot of answers that was going to present themselves. But how does one actually ever really plan for, a pandemic that essentially locks down the whole country? You can't plan for that. Sure, you can have savings and you can have all these things set aside, but it's not something that you can ever foresee. And at the pace that this thing presented itself to us, you would have asked anyone in the beginning of 2020, do you think they're going to shut down the country and stop this and, close restaurants? And you'd laugh at them. So, I don't think there's anything that we would have done different, because this is all new to us, it's, and we're far more equipped. We fast forward to 2021, where we are essentially in the almost exact time period with which the lockdown went into effect in 2020. I think we're a lot more equipped to deal with it and almost deep down expect another lockdown to happen. And I think emotionally we're a lot more equipped. We're a lot more prepared from a business standpoint, saving, cash flow. So I think the blow will be less, not to say that it won't be a blow. But I've become quite numb to the notion, and like most entrepreneurs have learned to navigate these murky waters. So it was a devastating thing for me. Last year, this time, I was certainly very worried and concerned, but very curiously trying to figure out solutions. Regarding the pandemic and the lockdown and how it's affected my industry from the music DJing side all the way through to my restaurants and venues and ultimately the festivals and events that I host, there was definitely a sense of frustration, and for a little while, a bit of anger towards the throttling of our game and our industry. I'm fortunate in a lot of ways to not just depend on the DJing side, but at the same time, the compounding responsibility and the risk linked to, the pandemic and the lockdown and the effect on my businesses obviously put me in a category that, it was very stressful. I realized that complaining was not going to do anything or change anything. So I had my moment of venting and, cussing at who and why. And, you start to read. And I think during that time, everyone was watching the news more than they were watching soapies and series. So there was this overwhelming information and disinformation that was funneling into to our minds and for us to try to figure out what the next steps were. So I eventually got fatigued from trying to get answers, and I ultimately just focused on what was on my plate, and had a deep dive into each of my businesses, which was my number one priority. The DJing aspect, it's a one-man band. There's nothing you can do, and ultimately, the way to box smart there was to not spend too much money buying music and just wait things out to see what the next steps were. Like I say, at that time, this time last year, you didn't know if this was going to last 3 months. You didn't know if this was going to last a year. And there was all sorts of speculation. So I turned my energy and focus into my businesses, and ultimately looked at ways to manage my cash flow, manage my debtors, and honestly try to devise a plan in terms of how I could stay afloat, how I can keep my staff still with me, because there's nothing worse than having to let people go when there's no other avenue to earn money. And fortunately for one of my businesses, I was able to retain everyone and keep everyone afloat. With Altitude, which was a new business and we had only been trading for 5 months, unfortunately had to retrench 40% of my staff, which was a really difficult thing to do, considering the fact that I didn't want to do it and I was forced to do it. But, it was to the detriment of, keeping my business alive. So, some very difficult decisions and emotional roller coasters that I had to deal with. But ultimately, keeping my attitude towards the situation focused on mitigating risk and waiting it out, engaging with the landlords. Again, going back to the fact that we were all in this together, pleading poverty, there's no shame in that with the landlords. But, I proposed a plan that didn't necessarily just focus on asking for rent holiday. I proposed a plan to say, well, look, I'm not able to trade at all now, but when can come out of it, I can start to pay this and that, and you know what I mean? So I think that was appreciated from their side, because ultimately they're in the same boat. And we found solutions. This whole thing was approached ultimately once we understood what we were dealing with. All my businesses were solution-based. And I am, pretty confident on the decisions that we made. I don't think I would have made any other decisions. And fast forward to when we were slowly able to open, we even tried takeaways. My establishments are not takeaway businesses, and everything that we were allowed to do, we tried. So ultimately, I can't look back and say, oh, I should have done that, could have done that. I mean, the alcohol takeaways they allowed on consumption venues and restaurants to do. I mean, it made no money, but we tried it, you know, free delivery, all these initiatives to try and, you know, make the experience for the consumer heightened and build the confidence again in getting them to support the establishments. From a music and DJing point of view, again, like the streaming thing kind of had its own little wave. I was never really a big believer in it. I participated in the one Dream Stream, which obviously, you know, it had an initiative of raising money for the industry. But, you know, it was probably far more devastating for the artists and DJs in the scene, because a lot of them, that's their careers. You know, and I've got various different things that feed into the pool of music and entertainment. So I don't just depend on one, even though everything was throttled. But if you're only DJing, I mean, even till today, there's a lot of guys that are still struggling, and that you know was a very difficult thing to digest, and you know, to kind of be very sympathetic to these guys that depend on this and their families and so on. So, how do you pivot from there? Being a DJ, producer, artist, you know, you use the time to be creative and produce music and put your time into that, which ultimately will yield positive results down the line. But the stress is still bearing in, you know, your life, in your creativity, and it's hard. It's hard. You know, I saw some very creative things being done, and putting their energy into positive things, but ultimately, you know, it was a waiting game for most of the industry. When we were allowed to reopen our venues slowly, and obviously with regulations and limited capacity from level 3 to level 2 to level 1, and back to level 2 and back to level 3, you know, we at both my venues, you know, took that very seriously. But the more we got to know about the virus and how it's affecting people, the more I felt that people needed to make their own decisions in terms of how they socialize. You know, as venues, we have a responsibility to, you know, to do the social distancing and, you know, insist on the customers wearing the masks and taking their temperature and so on. But ultimately, a lot of those regulations are flawed, and this is my opinion. You know, you are allowed to book a table for 10 people that come from 5 different households. You expect them to sanitize, wear their masks until they sit at the table, and then they take their masks off and they can hug and kiss one another. Nowhere in the regulations does it say they can't do that. So you take that in isolation, you know, why are we limited to 100 people and not able to get 200 people? And if we're allowed 200 people, why aren't we allowed 500 people? With the same principle, because yes, you're trying to contain things and so on, but you know, there's no scientific proof as to why we are limited to those numbers. So there's a frustration that underlines, as a business owner, these regulations, because it makes no sense. And you know, I've voiced this in you know, different interviews and dealing with different suppliers and that kind of thing. Listen, it's the law is the law, and we keep to it. But you know, Altitude Beach is a venue that can take 2,000 people, and I'm having to keep to, you know, only hosting 250 people. And it's an open air venue. I mean, both my venues are open air venues, which, according to the science, is less of a risk to be in an indoor confined space. So we have hustled in every way possible in terms of how we've been allowed to trade. And, you know, I'm blessed that, you know, both establishments have been well supported. Altitude hasn't been able to open at every step because it's a much bigger venue. So when the right lockdown level has been activated, we've obviously opened. And every time we've opened, we've been very well supported. and are very much on a road to recovery in terms of being a new business and paying back the investment that we put into the business. So it gives me confidence that there's light at the end of the tunnel. The Ivy, you know, again, speaking for myself, has had a tremendous reaction to all the different lockdown phases. And we've done anything and everything that we needed to do to stay alive, you know. And I don't regret that. Without even saying what it is, I don't regret doing what I've had to do to save my business. And I'm sure there's many other entrepreneurs, restaurateurs, venue owners that agree with me. And I'm optimistic. I'm hopeful of the next couple of weeks. They say there's a third wave coming. Again, I'm numb to it, but we will pivot and we'll have to deal with the regulations and the circumstances that provide to us. But my energy is focused on experience and is focused on managing the cash flow of my business so that I'm able to keep my staff and I'm able to keep the lights on and to continue the legacy of my venues.